For those of us who are a part of the tail end of the baby boom, a happy childhood was at least in part thanks to the advent of the first serious attempt at a science fiction TV series, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, which by today's standards not only had really bad acting, but the science was usually pretty bad too, although in many ways it was a visionary program, and they can even claim to having envisioned things that technologically were not in existence but came into existence after the show started. George Takei, is that how his name is pronounced? George Takei, played Sulu, the helmsman of the USS Enterprise. And George Takei did go on to star in other shows. At some point in time, he made news by revealing the fact that he was gay. It was kind of like Anderson Cooper. It's like, brother, we've known that for a while. But he's translated his public notoriety into a very meaningful gay rights advocacy role. He's one of the people who has used his fame in very admirable ways. In recent years, he's become very well known for his extremely snarky social media presence. Now, I loved him when he was Sulu during my childhood, but I can tell you, I think I love him more now on a daily basis when I see his sardonic posts about our conservative politicians. Oh, my breakfast friend didn't put my manuscript back in order. Thank you, Elizabeth. Takei was born a United States citizen in California. Takei's mother was also born a citizen in California. His father was an immigrant, but he had become a citizen before Takei was born. But when he was just 5 years old, 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, his family was rounded up with 120,000 other people of Asian descent who lived on the west coast of America and was imprisoned in an internment camp for 3 years. His parents told him they were going on vacation, and he was 5, and you believe your parents. And so he thought everybody went on vacation in a railroad boxcar with soldiers with machine guns pointed at them. Americans of Japanese descent were suddenly cast as being potential enemies of the state. They were taken away from their jobs, homes, businesses, farms, and property, and put behind barbed wire in miserable camps where they were surrounded by armed guards and watched over from menacing guard towers. When World War II was ended, they were released from their camps, and everyone was given a bus ticket to anywhere in America they wanted to go and a $20 bill to help them start their lives over again in the land that had just robbed them of farms, businesses, homes, taken away 3 years of their productive lives, all in an unconstitutional, knee-jerk reaction of racism and fear. Now, as bad as the internment of Japanese Americans in the late 1940s was, or mid-1940s, it obviously wasn't as bad as America's 2 original sins of 18th and 19th century practices of African slavery, or the genocide of Native Americans, followed by the forced removal to reservations where many Native Americans still live today. And maybe that's why the internment is not mentioned that often. But this was not a sin of America's frontier. This is not a product of pre-modern mentality that had not learned from the sins of past generations. This was in the middle of the 20th century. My parents were adults. This was when the world was shocked by the cruelty of Nazis who were forcing Jews into barbed wire concentration camps. We were decrying the abuses of the Japanese against Koreans and Chinese. But the architects of this move to ignore judicial process, to ignore the Constitution and everything our country stands for, was none other than President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the then California Attorney General, who would soon become our nation's famous liberal Supreme Court Justice, Earl Warren. Franklin during his time in office, was broadly feared to be a socialist because he was so liberal in so many ways. He brought the Great Depression to an end through his New Deal measures. He built the coalition that won World War II. He created Social Security. He established the minimum wage. And he did a lot to do away with racial discrimination in employment and housing. But this famous liberal also signed Executive Order 9066 that indefinitely incarcerated Japanese Americans in internment camps. Earl Warren was California's Attorney General, but he was running for governor at the time. Now, we remember him because he presided over the court that made the life-changing decision in the Brown versus the Board of Education. He also tried to rein in aggressive police tactics in the famous Miranda versus Arizona case that gave us the institution of Miranda rights. But the guy who integrated schools and the guy who gave us civil protections against police abuse ran for governor in 1942 under the slogan, "Let's get rid of the Japs." And he facilitated the Secretary of War's rounding up of all of the Japanese Americans in California, put them on cargo trains at gunpoint, and sent them off to internment camps in miserable and inhospitable places. Warren was seen as being so liberal on the Supreme Court that there was a massive impeach Earl Warren movement at the time. But in February of 1942, this man who would become our most famous liberal did one of the most racist and unconscionable acts of the 20th century. And I think this is important for us to be aware of, is that we find it very easy as liberals to intellectually be condescending towards conservatives. But when you look at some of the worst things our country has done, liberals did it, and they did it under circumstances that didn't call for those actions. Now, these are two of the most important books in my library. For those of you on podcast, the books are Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States and a book by Lowen called Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's not as famous, but it's a very important book. Whenever I'm writing about something that involves American history, I always check both of these books to check my perception against them, because they have gone farther than anyone else I know to undo the propaganda that most of us were fed by our public school textbooks in our early childhood. Lowen and Zinn together, it's more than 1,100 pages in which they compile remarkable evidence of the truth of American history. However, when it comes to the internment of these 1,200 or 120,000 Japanese American, many of whom, as Takei was, were children or were already citizens of the United States, Lowen doesn't even mention it. There's not a word. Howard Zinn, who's one of my real heroes, two short paragraphs on page 416. Out of all of this work, even mentioned this incredibly dark chapter in American history. And I mean, really, you have to think, you bring this into a contemporary moment. If our federal government sent troops to round up everyone in Springfield and Willard and Nixa and Ozark and put us onto boxcars and shipped us off to an internment camp for 3 years, can you even imagine that happening? And yet it happened. How did it happen? How could it have been carried out by leaders who we largely remember as heroes? And I remember reading a biography of Earl Warren, doesn't mention this. You put Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the most honorific sorts of terms, but we rarely associate him with this. How can it be so benignly forgotten? In a nation that cherishes freedom, independence, and don't we cherish the ownership of private property and the liberty to do what we want to with our lives? How did we do this? In a word, it happened because generally good people were scared. You think of the Holocaust, the German people at that time were the most educated, most technologically advanced nation in the world. How were they led to put Jews into concentration camps? It was fear. They were taught to blame the Jews for their economic distress, for their anxiety about their future. Good people, and I don't say that lightly, generally good people can be persuaded to do horrible things if you can scare them first, if you can get them to think out of their primitive brainstem, out of fear. Now, there's greed and racism mixed in and a good deal of irresponsibility. But for the moment, let's just focus on how easy it is to manipulate good people when they're scared. In 1992, Mike Huckabee, the father of our current White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee, was running for Senate in Alabama. And in that campaign, and you all remember the 90s when the AIDS scare just had people sitting on the edge of their seats. He suggested that we take everyone that was HIV positive and put them in an internment camp. Now, when he was running for president years later, he was asked, he was the front runner in the, when was that? In the 2008, wasn't it, primary? He was the front runner. He was asked if he would like to walk that statement back. And he said no. He still agreed that HIV positive people would need to be put in an internment camp for the general welfare of the country. But frankly, so far as the sentiment of gay community goes, our current Vice President, Mike Pence, is not too far off. He was governor in Indiana and suggested that they take their AIDS money that was being used for treatment and what have you, and give it all to evangelical Christian groups that practice conversion therapy. As if Mike Huckabee himself doesn't know that conversion therapy doesn't work. I mean, come on, let's get real about him. Neither Huckabee nor Pence seem to be aware of the fact that a fourth of AIDS patients in America are not gay. But why confuse prejudice with facts? All of which pales in comparison to the very public discussion in the final month before our 2016 presidential election, when Trump surrogates were citing the 1940s Japanese internment camps as a legal precedent for rounding up Muslims who were living in the United States. Now, I believe that you guys trust me not to make this stuff up. But this is a big claim, so I want to, Rob, if you'll share just a few seconds of this Fox News interview, just to get it straight from the source.
Yeah, and perfectly honest, it is legal. They say it'll hold constitutional muster. I know the ACLU is going to challenge it, but I think it'll pass. And we've done it with Iran back a while ago. We did it during World War II with Japanese, which, you know, call it what you will, maybe wrong.
You're not proposing we go back to the days of internment camps, I hope.
No, I'm not proposing that at all, Megan. But what I am saying is that we need to protect America.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets people scared, Carl.
Right. But I'm just saying there is precedent for it, and I'm not saying I agree with it. But in this case, I absolutely believe that a regional-based...
You can't be citing Japanese internment camps as precedent for anything the president-elect is going to do.
Look, the president needs to protect America first. And if that means having people that are not protected under our Constitution have some sort of registry so we can understand, until we can identify the true threat and where it's coming from, I support it.
You get the protections once you come here. All right. Carl, good to see you.
I'm not lying about this. I'd like to believe that this nonsense is part of what made Megyn Kelly decide to rescue what scraps of her dignity might have remained intact and make a very pricey exit from Fox News. But Carl Higbee, who was a spokesperson for the Trump campaign, thought that it was safe to go on Fox News and declare that the Japanese internment in the 1940s was legal precedent for a Muslim internment in 2017. And that ought to be sobering to us, that there are still people in positions of power who think that that is something we could do. Now, our current president seems to be unwilling to apologize for anything, and God knows he's got a lot to apologize for. But 45 years after the internment, it was no one less than Ronald Reagan who did formally apologize for this dark chapter in American history and promised a reparation of $20,000 to each of the surviving Americans who were interred in those camps. He said he was going to. He didn't do it, but, you know, I'd rather have someone promise me $20,000 than not apologize. They did at least get the apology. They have paid reparations to a few survivors, but they're trying to run out the clock. Not many of them are alive now, and they are dying off rapidly. So there's not a lot of people that actually got the check, but they did at least get an apology. What I'm suggesting to you today is that we go one step further by resolving right now to never do anything again that's like that, that we can preempt the apology by not doing it. Fear seems to break down religious convictions and cross all conservative and liberal political lines and literally turn us all into moral pygmies. My suggestion to you today is, long before the next incident happens, when we have either some great hero or some moron calling for barbed wire and watchtowers, that we are not going to make any more decisions based on fear. Faith, after all, does not so much mean blind belief as it means having the courage of your convictions. We are people of faith, and I think we should just stop being afraid. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.